Alrighty, welcome online and in person to Concordia University's fourth space. Thanks so much for joining us for Decolonizing Spaces, Public Art, Curatorial Museum, and Publication Models. We're so excited to launch into this conversation, but first, I just wanted to help situate everyone by letting you know that we are streaming to YouTube live from fourth space, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands here in Jogé, Montreal. At Fourth Space, we work with our community of researchers to connect people to their ongoing projects through activities that invite conversation, sometimes hands-on participation, with the goal really of mobilizing and sharing knowledge. And this week, it's our pleasure to work with Elastic Spaces to activate the Thinking Aloud project. So to launch right into it and get us going, it's my pleasure to pass the floor to Santiago and Laura. Welcome.
Hi, Anna. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. First, I wanted to thank our presenters and everyone that's connected online and here in person at Fourth Space. So today's panel is following two other panels that started this week. And today's panel is called Decolonizing Spaces, Public Art, Curatorial, Museum, and Publication Models. In the order, it'll be the way the panel will work. Each presenter will have about 10 minutes to present. Then we'll go into discussion with our respondent, who's Gary Sangster, a curator, writer, and researcher who's connected online. And then the last half an hour we'll take questions from the audience here at Fourth Space or also online. So the order, we'll start first. I'll start the presentation with my collaborator, Laura Costa. We'll introduce ourselves during the presentation. Then we'll follow with Haema Sivanesan, who's connected on Zoom, who's a curator and a director of the Latent Studios and Program Partnerships at the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity. Then Charan Singh will present, who's an artist, researcher as well, lectured at Kingston University in London, UK. He lives and works in New Delhi and London, and is a PhD alumni from the Royal College of Art. The presentation will be followed by Diyar Mayil, who's an artist in residence at Studio Arts Concordia, the 2022 Brumfan Fellowship, a fellow recipient, and who's also an artist in sculpture, installation, and performance. So we'll see a bit of Diyar's work. This presentation will be followed by Sunny Kerr, who's a curator and lecturer at Queen's University. He's the curator of contemporary art at the Agnes Etherington Art Center at Queen's University. And the last presentation will be by Barbara Clausen, an associate professor in art history and an associate dean for research and creation at the Faculty of Arts at UQAM here in Montreal. So I guess we'll get started with our presentation. So let me share the screen. All right, so today I'm going to be, like I was saying, presenting with Laura Costa about our collaborative practice and our research that explores perspectives of the other and spaces of dislocation and decolonization. So I'm Santiago Tavera. I'm a multimedia artist and researcher. I graduated from the MFA program here at Concordia University back in 2016. In my own practice, I use digital media, different technologies to construct immersive and interactive installations, always with the goal of simulating virtual narratives of migrant and queer experiences, always from the perspective of the other. So my work often becomes mixed media compositions, combining videos, 3D animations, text, sound, some archival material, as well as architectural elements in the space.
My name is Laura Costa. I also graduated from the MFA at Concordia in 2017 from the Fibers and Material Practices MFA. And I'm currently working as the head of wardrobe in the theater department. In my work, I'm interested in combining performance and textile practices such as costuming, sculpture, and installations to create surreal scenographies that explore identity, performativity, and in essence, questions the patterns through which we relate to ourselves and to space.
So while we're going to be speaking, you're going to be seeing some footage of our collaboration, which started back in 2015, where we started combining a bit of my interest on installation practices and interactive works with Laura's textile and performance interest. This led to the creation of the project titled The Novels of Elsewhere, Elsewhere as the Spanglish of Elsewhere, which is a series of audiovisual installations and interactive projects that deal with themes of displacement, representation, identity, and belonging. So we use a lot of different media, as you can see in the video, to place audiences in spaces that are in this constant translation between physical and virtual experiences.
So Santiago and I share a similar experience of being Colombian immigrants in Canada. We both arrived at a young age in Ontario, and we had the experience of being brought up in a constant state of translation between two cultures, kind of having two mother cultures. So this inspired our research in looking at how an experience of rupture and displacement actually points to a critical moment where one can rethink their relationship with themselves and others. So for us, this experience of dislocation, while sometimes painful and uncomfortable, can actually be an opening moment for the creation of new ways of perceiving the world. And this stems from the perspectives of the other here being the immigrant, queer, BIPOC body. And so for us in our installations, we look to bringing forward the perspectives of the other and using a sense of dislocation as the method to open up the possibility for a space of decolonization.
So for us, this concept of decolonizing spaces really means the challenge of rethinking the dynamics between bodies and the spaces they inhabit. So moving towards more non-hierarchical, intersectional, and community-based ways of perceiving and living in the world. So through our work, we try to establish spaces of decolonial thought by opening spaces of collaboration, community building, where we can uplift and include diverse perspectives and intersectional perspectives, while creating counter narratives within the communities we belong to. So our installations present a network of lights, sounds, videos, sensors, textiles, performance, and different technologies to submerge audiences within immersive and interactive environments. So the novels of Elsewhere are ecosystems. They really become networks where viewers can become active participants in each installation spaces they visit, and how their presence and actions are also connected to their environment and the different elements around them. So we think how often their presence in some of our works have the potential to alter and transform some of the audiovisual elements that are present there, which is the scene that you're seeing right now in the video. So your presence activates different elements to the installation.
So the series is composed of 5 installations. Each one has been referred to as an episode. We are inspired by our Latino upbringing, watching telenovelas, which are soap operas. And we really are interested in how these stories present complex narratives through melodrama and fiction. So that's kind of like the inspiration to how we approach the audiovisual installations. And so through the series from episode 1 to episode 5, we have an abstract connecting narrative of a body emerging, going through a rupture, experiencing a sense of longing, then finding ways of adapting to a space, and finally becoming a new form. Episode 1, maybe we can start showing the images. We'll briefly go through all the episodes to sort of show the overarching narrative. Episode 1, it's titled When the River Sings, Stones It Brings, is a video installation where we wanted to explore the idea of body as territory and reflecting on how our skins and our physical features, similar to the natural environment, have been shaped and transformed over time through processes of colonialism, migration, and diaspora. These processes that maybe looked to try to erase certain bodies, in essence, our skins and our features are the testaments to what actually happened. So this installation is composed of video projection mapping onto a large-scale inflatable textile sculpture, along with a setup of multiple screen monitors and spatialized sound. With this piece, we wanted to evoke a sensation of a breathing territory and an unidentified body.
Episode 3 is called Live Despecho. This one explores how migrant, queer, or other bodies constantly transform through multiple layers of identities while inhabiting multiple physical and virtual sites. And eventually how this leads to a deep sense of longing, which is despecho in Spanish, or similar to that. Live Despecho is an augmented audiovisual experience that invites viewers to participate in a mise-en beam of video projections, 3D graphics, 360 virtual reality piece, CCTV live camera setup, and a performance with wearable textile sculptures. So audiences in this space encounter an immersive performance both in the physical gallery space as well as in a virtual headset, while becoming part of the installation through the live camera setup.
The following episode is episode 4, Camouflage Screams, which is an interactive installation where we wanted to explore the asymbiotic relationship between us and the natural environment. With this piece, we were reflecting on how the climate crisis that we're going through is a direct result of humans' denial that our actions, capitalist, extractivist, colonialist histories have an effect on the natural environment. So through this augmented experience, we incorporated large-scale panoramic video projections of a recorded performance with textile pieces, along with motion sensors, enveloping soundscapes, lighting setups, and sculptural elements. When the audience moved around this installation, their movements had the ability to alter the image and sounds of the space. With this piece, we wanted to ask viewers to really reflect on how their presence and their actions are not isolated events, but they have a direct effect on the environments that surround them, as we're all part of a network.
Episode 5, If I Saw You, I Don't Remember, is an immersive installation that plays with the threshold between body and space by presenting various iterations of a body that is never really seen in its entirety. So ultimately, the body itself manifests as the space itself. So the movements and the presence of this unseen body, which was a performer that we worked with in this installation, along with a reflective textile piece, were recorded through video, audio, and motion sensors to then be translated into large video projections, spatialized sound, live video streams, light compositions, and 3D animations. So this really created an immersive network that aimed to question our perception of disability, inclusion, and exclusion by asking the audience to reflect on how bodies that are deemed invisible can shift, adapt to eventually transform the space they inhabit. So right now, as you might have noticed, we didn't mention episode 2. It's an episode that it's going to be exploring rupture, and it's in the making right now. So it'll be ready for next year. And in the last year, we were also working on an interactive app and video documentary of the novels of Elsewhere, where eventually you can enter these episodes through more in a virtual realm, activate the different elements that were also present in the physical installation, and engage also with the performers, the textile, the videos, the sound, and so forth. And you will get access also to some archival material, behind the scenes, how we made it, as well as interviews with the community that's kind of built around this project of the novels of Elsewhere. So the team members, interviews with ourselves, obviously, as well as the performers and curators and collaborators that have been around this large project. So we'll finish our presentation at that. We can continue the conversation after. So now we'll move on to Haema, who's online right now. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Also, the videos of each episode will be, we'll have them on a TV too, if in case you want to hear some of the sound and watch them all. So over to you, Haema. Thank you. You're muted. So am I. Oh, we can't hear you, Haema. You're muted.
Okay, there we go. And can you see my screen as well?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so thank you, Leila, and the organizing team of Thinking Aloud for inviting me to be part of this panel. What I would like to do today is to talk briefly about a couple of projects that I undertook in a previous role as the curator at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria. These projects ran parallel and intersected with the research that Leila Sujir has been undertaking in the old growth forests on Vancouver Island. And I, along with many other scholars, define decolonization as the decentering of Eurocentric worldviews and paradigms. This is a simple definition for what is obviously a very complex concept to unpack and put into action, especially if you don't have other knowledge paradigms to draw from or refer to. I moved to Victoria in 2016 to take up the curatorial role. And my experience of Victoria was as a predominantly white settler enclave on a large island among dozens and dozens of Indigenous reserves. And I was very conscious of the expressly colonial image of the city, defined by the imposing provincial legislature buildings, the Fairmont Empress Hotel, the monuments to Queen Victoria and Captain Cook and John A. Macdonald, which has since been removed by the city, actually, and all the tourist shops along Government Street that sold an image of British culture to American tourists. Let's see, how am I going to do this? But once you are outside of Victoria's downtown, you realize that Vancouver Island has the highest population of First Nations people of any region in BC, but it takes an effort to go beyond the tourist stereotypes to begin to really understand the situation of First Nations people on the island and to begin to think about our roles and responsibilities as settlers working in institutions. So one of the first exhibitions that I made when I first moved to Victoria was titled Point of Contact on Place and the West Coast Imaginary, and that was from 2017. It's an exhibition that reflected on the experience of first contact on the West Coast at the village or town site that is now known as UQÀM on the far northwest coast of Vancouver Island. This is the traditional territory of the Moachamuchalat peoples and was where in 1778, Captain James Cook first encountered the Indigenous people of the west coast of what is now part of Canada. The exhibition focused broadly on the mythology of first contact, invoking both the romanticism and the racism of the various representations of that historical moment. And I'll just click through a few of the images quickly. One of the foundations of decolonial work in galleries and museums is that the curatorial approaches be place-based. And with this exhibition, I was looking to find a way to bring local Indigenous voices and Indigenous artists' agency into the gallery. The exhibition included Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists, historical as well as contemporary works across a range of media. I was trying to figure out ways to decenter conventional art historical narratives and representations of the Canadian West Coast and to disrupt or interrupt curatorial conventions related to the way we show our predominantly Eurocentric collections in public art galleries. So I was wanting to bring an Indigenous perspective, but indeed, I needed artwork that could really have impact. I worked closely with a young colloquiate artist, Jelma Wenstob, whose work, this is a model of a longhouse enclosed within the glass walls of one of the galleries at the HEGV. So the longhouse appeared as though it was enclosed within a vitrine. And this work was central to the exhibition, and you can immediately see how it decenters literally and physically the settler representations of the first contact experience. The perspective that this work brought to the exhibition was one of loss of culture, loss of knowledge, loss of family and ancestry. But it was a perspective that literally took up space alongside what is usually a colonial dominant perspective. Haema introduced me to a network of elders, community leaders, artists in the various Indigenous communities around Victoria. And from there, I could begin to find ways to connect with Indigenous protocol in my curatorial working methods and initiate a process of relationship building. It was important to take a community engaged approach in my curatorial work so as to create an environment that would assist to welcome Indigenous visitors to the gallery. A second exhibition that I made in 2018 was called Supernatural, Art, Technology and the Forest. It was a group exhibition, and it looked at how photo-based media in particular contributed to settler understandings of the forest landscape on Vancouver Island. I was interested in how photography as an art form arising out of a Western colonial art canon had mediated and shaped the settler understanding of the natural landscape, where this picturing of the landscape played a significant role in our imagining of British Columbia, and therefore how photography affected our relationship to place. The idea and imagery of the forest is central to BC's brand, shall we say, being the icon of its tourism campaigns, at the same time that logging, paradoxically, continues to be a key economic driver. And perhaps it's stating the obvious to say this, but what I learned through the exhibition is how hugely emotive the idea of the forest can be, at the same time that the general understanding of what a forest is as a self-sustaining ecosystem is not really well understood. It was sort of at this point that my curatorial work began to intersect more closely with Leila's research. And as an outreach program of the Supernatural exhibition, we coordinated a field trip with a number of the exhibiting artists to go out to the South Woolburn Forest and to spend a day hiking and just sitting in the forest. The following day, we organized a community lunch and screenings where Leila screened rushes of footage that she and her team had shot in the same forest a few weeks prior. And what Leila and I were beginning to develop was a long-term approach to community engagement that would shape and inform the development of the body of work that she's currently working on, titled Forest Documents. So this wasn't the artist or curator sort of parachuting into a community and making images or exhibitions in an extractive way, but these curatorial events inaugurated a long-term investment in a community-engaged process of learning about the land, the people, the history, the politics, and the very real double bind of a colonial past, and what Elder Bill Jones has named as a neo-colonial future that confronts most Indigenous nations in Canada today. I've written extensively about this project and the community engaged process in an article in the Journal of Transcultural Studies, where I reflect on a whole set of complex issues related to the concept of decolonization and the reality of the political situation of First Nations people in BC. I feel very strongly that decolonization is not a term to be used lightly, especially as you become aware of the very real colonial pressures that First Nations people are subject to even today. So quickly just want to make a few points with regards to decolonial curatorial models. Firstly, to say that curatorial work needs to be place-based with a clear recognition of the land and whose land you're on and your own relationship then to that land. Decolonial curatorial models require significant and expanded approach to community engaged work with Indigenous consent. especially on unceded land, as we were in Victoria, and respecting Indigenous protocol. Consequently, the work needs to be relational, ethical. We need to go into these communities with humility, because decolonial work requires us to set aside our idea of the world to be open and receptive to the beliefs and worldviews of others. And that through that process, you'll be confronted with many paradoxes, difficult situations, and ethical conundrums. I feel that decolonization is not an end goal, but it is a process and a paradigm. It's an ethic and a way of going forward into the world with awareness, sensitivity, and with an intention to redress colonial harms. But I also agree with Sumaya Qasim and many other scholars and cultural commentators who argue that the museum and art galleries and cultural institutions more broadly cannot be decolonized. The meaningful sites of social change are not from within colonial institutions, but from without. And as Linda Tuhiwai-Smith suggests in her text, Decolonial Methodologies, decolonial spaces are those informal spaces of refuge that Indigenous and racialized people create and protect despite the institution. They're contingent parallel spaces, they're relational spaces, they're everyday spaces, and they're truly cultural spaces. And we create these spaces through processes of engagement and exchange, over coffee, over lunch, while sitting in the forest, or on the long drives that Leila, Jorge, and I undertook up and down the island. The most significant work then takes place when we can decenter conventional curatorial models and traditional forms of exhibition to create forms of exhibition that allow for authentic cultural exchange. And in these situations, I think the exhibition is secondary to the processes of relationship building. So I'm going to leave it at that and pass it on to the next panelist. Thank you.
Thank you, Haema, for introducing the projects and this sense of new models of museum models consisting on community-based approaches and including, indigenous voices and perspectives into these institutions. So we'll continue that conversation after, and we'll give the mic, the space to Charan. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we see it.
Okay, great. Okay. Hello, everybody. And thank you, Santiago and Leila and everybody at the Thinking Aloud project. And my name is Charan. And I'm going to speak a little bit about the community that I was working for many years in India. And my PhD is based on that community. And I think it was interesting, especially with Haema's presentation, that there are people, both of you and Haema describing decolonizations as a process which sort of like dealing with Western powers and especially in the Western spaces, but also I think where I situated, I'm trying to situate this project of decolonizations within the country which is colonized, like India, but they also have this whole, architecture of colonialism and power structure, which people from those within those subaltern population have to deal with that within their own populations and within their own cultural spaces. My presentation called Going Sideways, Learning to Leap. And it comes very much from the language, which also talks about, colonial language. And I start speaking about that. My mouth clenches to twitch and my tongue forces on in, stretches on D, and then releases on A, India. And then exhale. As hard as it is it to fit India in my mouth? Is it even harder to swallow the term acquired immunodeficiency syndrome that shaped the fate of the Kotis population, that is a subaltern population within queer movements in the 90s, that arose in the 90s, and how they are going to be recognized in the coming decades, a term which is continue to jostle with my tongue. And when we discuss queer movements very often across the world, actually, which was colonized world, they always talk about this one law, which is Section 377, which was inherited by the colonial powers, especially British government in many colonies, and it still exists in many parts of the world, which basically describes the same-sex as unnatural offenses, and that becomes a part of the major project about the awareness. So it became very much about the law because it was speaking to various other projects across the world. But on the other hand, HIV also spreading across the late 80s and the 90s in India, and this was one of the first project which first protest AIDS anti-discrimination movement started. But in the parallel, and then the law changed in 2009, and then it reversed in 2013, and then it's gone back now in 2018. It was reversed again. So now at the moment we are decriminalized, but not legal in that sense. But on the parallel world, because those movements which speaking to other movements in the Western world, they were all focused on the question of privacy, and that like queer people have privacy, and so the language of law is very much about the privacy. But when you think about country like India, then we have a question of privacy and the economic divide, and who have the privacy, because very often people are living in a shared accommodation with their families and various other people. Then how do we have the privacy? And so this one of the work that I made about if you get the love letter, but how do you read the love letter from your lover because you don't have the private space? So it's very much about the location of the locations and language, and I'll speak a little bit further about that. So this law basically discuss about the so when we got the judgment, right now the law says that anything between two consenting adults in private space is outside the legal boundary. But then where do you find the private space, especially when we have the large population who don't have private spaces? And thinking about the leap started somewhere in 2009, especially when the first judgment came in place in 2009. And I started naively to discuss with my peers who are non-English speaking, who don't have school education, even a lot of people who can't read and write. And then I was trying to talk to them that the law has changed in the center, and which is which was the major project by English-speaking queer folks in the city centers. And I was talking to this person who was in somewhere in a very far village area, who was saying that I don't know, I mean, a lot of people didn't even knew that law existed, so let alone that the law affecting in their life, so it was a very complicated scenario in which law only existed because it was also threatening to people who are in the city, so to speak. And so, but in a parallel world, in my HIV world, I was also dealing with the indigenous identities, which were Kotis and Hijras and trans. But then every time when we translating our identity, we were coming across terms like trans or terms like MSM, which is an acronym for male to male who have sex with male. And in those days, I used to think that maybe people in the West, people like me are called MSM, because that's the one of the dichotomy, that how certain the the so much of the conversations about queerness and right movements, it takes place in English language, and there's so many people outside those language, spaces, who are creating their own spaces, who have much longer culture and histories. And but then when we are often forced to translate into a very limited LGBTIQ framework. So these were the parallel world where people were creating their own spaces for sharing, information, but also social support. And because, as I said, that a lot of people couldn't read and write, so then those NGOs who are promoting safe sex information, that simply couldn't, and people couldn't understand, simply because a lot of people could not read and write. So we were being forced to make sure that they understand what AIDS means. But then we also know that a lot of people could not pronounce the word of HIV and AIDS. So when I was doing my MA, so many years later, I was disenchanted by the whole project, because I could see that there was so much mistranslating happening within the queer spaces, because a lot of people couldn't read and write. But then there was all these other things were happening, especially in the US. In the 90s, Judith Butler wrote very big book about gender trouble and many other things. But then it also completely erased, so to speak, because very often people go to Western universities and they learn from that, and then they could not translate what the kind of identity that existed in their own countries or in own spaces. And very often they've been translated as trans people rather than their own term that these people are identified. So when I was doing, in 2012, I enrolled myself into MFA photography, and I tried to create this project in which I call this project Koti, Hijraz, and others. And I asked people to come to the drop-in center where we were meeting and ask them to perform for the camera, and I asked them to make to take their own, give them the full canvas, and they can perform the way they want to be performed. And very often people come, they know how to perform, but some people don't even knew how to stand for the camera. So that very often they would acquire TV and Bollywood cinema persona, and like the one on the far left, who's wearing the sari, purple sari. So this is a very kind of typical character of a woman who's trying to find the desirable husband, but she could not find. So it's a kind of courtesan character. And so I'm going to show this 2-minute video. Later on, I try to create various kinds of narrative-based program, project, photo project, primarily talking about these underclass communities of Khotis and Hijras, while showing, not to show them as the way they've been documented over the years since the 90s by NGOs, but showing what they bring onto the table, what kind of life they have, how they are coping and how they're surviving, how they're finding love and various other things. And very often my work also talks about, punctuates with glossary, because there are so many things that we understood very differently. For example, like collaboration or consent, because so much it's about the language and how language is being used. So I try to create the things that are differently understood within communities, and very often they are in public spaces where people are finding their privacy. So even though this is a public space, public garden, but it's also a place where people are finding privacy within those spaces, and they are hiding within plain sight. Because the people who are creating their own longing and belonging within these premises, and this place is also, cruising place is also very interesting, because they could leave behind all the gender and societal pressure outside. They can also leave the law outside, and they could be who they want. And very often people would be change their identity from one place to the other. And and I made this video work, which is also about HIV and how people are finding how people are living with HIV. Very often, so in which I try to imply the concept of waiting and anticipation, because very often what happens when you see everything, because one of the problem for me was when I was making work, and when I make work, is about how to separate the economy from those people, because very often when you see the person, they are already, you can identify the economy, which economy they belong to, and that's became one of the criteria to identify those people. And then so in this one, I just try to create a different space, like this person is just waking up, and this is in between the time where people are waking up and they are not fully what they are, and they are reflecting on their self, and they're reflecting on their being living with HIV and AIDS. And also the work doesn't give full answer to you, and it speaks because first I try to make work in English language, but then I decided not to make, because when I make the work with English language, it was not reaching to people that I was making for. And when I make in Indian language, then Western audience can't understand. So I decided to keep the mix language in the work. And then I started, I collaborate sometimes with Sunil Gupta, who's my partner, and we make work collaboratively. We created this body of work, which is Delhi Community of Belonging. It is about city, and because and between two of us, we kind of have access to a broader range of people. This work was about 20 people, 20 lives, ranging from people who are, teaching in universities, but also people who are working on as sex worker on the street. So there was a range of people, and then it was shown in this kind of space, which the yellow color was a room of a drawing room, in which we are trying to invite people from all the different economic groups and trying to have the conversation, because in the exhibition space, they will also have a quotation from each person, and so there is a kind of dialogue going in between. So this was shown for the first time in India, in Kochi Biennial, and yeah, so this is another project. Yeah, I'm going to finish with this. This is the last project I did with asylum seeker in the UK. It was shown as posters in Gay Village in Birmingham in the UK, and yeah, and I think I'll be happy to take up some questions during our conversations. And this is
perfect. Thank you.
Yeah,
Charan.
thank you.
So we'll move on to Diyar, who's here to my left.
I have my own microphone, but
Perfect.
checking. Okay. Just a second. Well, okay. Hi, thank you. It's such an exciting moment for me to share my work, especially after hearing in depth your works and seeing the parallels. And I'm looking forward to the discussion period at the end of our presentations. I'm going to present you my recent body of work titled House Guest. And this project starts from the feeling of displacement as its ever increasing significance is like important to all of us, especially it's very personal for me. But other than that, as I worked on this project, I start to think of displacements in other terms, because I'm always interested in bringing and leaving room for others rather than talking about or like dwelling on something that is just personal. I mean, I believe that we all start from the personal, but I'm always worried and like aiming to bring it to a place where we can meet and gather. So I think it overlaps with the idea of hosting and being a guest as well. If you think of, we are hosting ideas, we are hosting, and we are guests to certain ideas and open to them. And in that, but in that sense, I would say for me, I got inspired and like triggered to think of all these for a very personal reason. But I understand that displacement can be a displacement within a room, like not being welcomed. Displacement can be being displaced and excluded from places as well. I think that there's parallels of that feeling. I'm more interested in an emotive response because feelings are very universal, but what they are felt for and their intensity and impact is different. That's where we can meet. And so I will start talking about text. I became more aware of the significance of words after living in Canada, because I think there's a sense of taking things for granted before you are displaced from something. And as an artist who works very intuitively, words are extremely important because what they call for next is defines, and I'm noticing what in English each word, what I just uttered last, calls for next is different than in Turkish. And I decided to keep a glossary, and I was so excited to see that others are doing that as well, and negotiating about language and how from which part of me I start the work from. And I think it's an example also to give instead of giving a full definition to audience, I prefer to give a glossary. I'd like to call it a glossary rather than a dictionary, because it sets an example that we can define things in our own ways, and emphasizes that there is that room for you. And this glossary is not like prepared after the work is made. It is actually a studio dictionary that I have been keeping since forever, to sometimes just for, in a playful manner, sometimes to keep pinpointing what repeats again and again, and not get lost in semiotics. So this is something I like sharing with, it's a part that I like sharing with the audience. And one other reason for this is I do see objects as words almost. There is and what I mean by that is I'm looking for a moment of intimacy, and I think it's the most, for me, the places where I can, everyone has a different method, right? For me, words and objects are where the most amplified intimacy happens. When you're alone with an object, when you're alone with a word, and when you're close to it, it has a different kind of closeness that I feel and that drives me. And this is why I try to keep it in my process. You know, thinking of both objects and material and words. I think it might be because of the fact that I'm someone who is like, who admires people who can write very well, because it's such an, like, there's some objects, I call them objects, objects on a piece of paper, the shapes that creates image. And I think sculpture does that semiotically. You see a brush at the door and you walk through it, even if your body is not brushing against it or you brush against it. There's a sense of reminding you maybe the places you walk through, or maybe makes you aware of what you see inside afterwards. Like after going in and reading that text or being close to a table, it is different when you are reminded of your body and reminded of your past, your action. So by intimacy, that's what I mean. And when I say the project started from the significance of displacement, is I am more interested in the lasting feelings of major events, because something happens and it's big and it's maybe sometimes we consider it as violent, but I find the living with that and the time after that is maybe even more unbearable. So in that sense, we try to find comfort, and but then discomfort always lives within it, and one feeling is not able to overcome the other. And I keep giving this example, but as an artist, I'm more interested in the silence after a fight rather than the fight itself. And so this is where this project started. And like I said, I'm going after an emotive response, and I'd like to give that room for the people who interact with my work. And so that can happen if only I keep a intense closeness to work myself while giving that distance. What I mean by that is if I make work that's deeply personal, but without being confessional. So this is a table, and I do believe in the magic of everyday objects, because sometimes when an object already has a high charge, high meaning, becomes a symbol, someone who sees that might not have the room to project themselves, might not have the room to create that intensity. So for me, a table or a mop, a dustpan is gives that room for me to meet with others through the work. And material choices are very important for me, and that's, I think, how I can create that feeling, almost like the semiotics of the work. When you see fragile legs on a table, what does it call for? Do you think of a moment where your knees shake, or you think of, or more of the tabletop where it seems like some things are bubbling up from underneath without popping out, the potential and the anticipation of things. So I try to make my material choices according to this, and keep under a feeling, umbrella of a feeling. Like if I am thinking of when I'm thinking of the table sculpture, and it should move out of being a table and become a table sculpture of a table. What does it mean, a table, for me? And why do I make this table? This is where it is personal. And I think, but in that terms, I have to make the choices according to what is the feeling that associated with the table, that it can convey materially when no one is there to talk about it. And this is the brush clock. It is actually a kinetic sculpture, but nothing much is happening. When I say kinetic sculpture, don't expect lots of huff and puff. It's a brass pendulum is hiding and peeking from the side to side, and coming together almost as a body pulsating in the room, overlooking the room with the other objects. I think it is the body in the room, and I'm interested in, of course, the idea of foreign. This seems like everything is very familiar. The brush on top is basically taken from a broom. You have seen a clock before. It's a plank of wood. Maybe the thing that's most strange is that skin-like texture that looks also like a flattened tongue to me, but everybody has a different reaction to it. When it comes together, it becomes strange. And I'm interested in that, creating this kind of sweet spot with the sculptures that you feel familiar and also foreign to them. And I feel that makes it, brings the body in it, and the body of displaced and out of place. Okay, well, so I'll show you some detailed shots. So another thing that threads in my work, and I'm noticing this lately, even though it's quite obvious to people who have been talking to me about it, is hiding. Maybe, for example, in the brush clock, this pendulum is hiding and peeking. In the table, there's the salt bubbles underneath. And in this medicine cabinet, there is all this content that's hiding almost like guts under the skin-like texture. And even in the brush, there is some residue always underneath that's like not so visible. I'm really interested in making something invisible and visible at the same time, and the duality of things to talk about, and not necessarily talk about, refeel and make it available to feel and contemplate about estrangement. And I do think we all feel it, but like I said, it's maybe more, even though that feeling of displacement, I acknowledge that it's a nuanced feeling, but of course there is more violent and forms of it. But I'm hoping it doesn't have to have the same intensity for us to feel each other and through objects, and that's what I'm trying to do with my sculptures.
Thank you. Thank you, Diyar. Okay, now we're gonna move on to hear Sunny Kerr, who's across the table. Thank you.
Thank you. Just gonna share my screen. So thank you all. It's an honor to be invited, Leila, into this conversation and in such great company. I wanted to share a project that's very much live and ongoing, unfinished, right at this very moment. Along the way, Decolonial Ecologies Playgroup, that is initiated as a relationship building project that is researching into the land where we are located, and to encourage land-based artistic practices and center local indigenous, in our case, Haudenosaunee worldviews through a process that is a site-based micro-residency process that I call playgroup. And playgroup is not a brand new form necessarily. It's a term that I borrow from Agnes Singh, but it's playgroup that'll be a kind of through line in the projects that I talk about today. So the first playgroup that we experimented with at Agnes began around this project, and I'm showing you this a bunch of screenshots from a forthcoming book about this project, Drift, Art and Dark Matter, to give you a sense of what that looks like. Essentially, the McDonald Institute, which is a physics research network, and Snow Lab invited us to collaborate on a residency and exhibition project. So I curated 4 artists to travel 2 kilometers underground in a mine in Sudbury to the dark matter physics lab that's there. And then the exhibition was a kind of generative outcome of that. And so playgroup comes into play here because I wanted, in general terms, a way to kind of break out of the way that exhibition schedules sort of confine a sense of research trajectory to a very kind of narrow block of time. And so the intention here was to invite another group of artists to kind of rub shoulders with these artists and the content and the research they were doing, and then sort of have it grow into a local, another kind of iteration of an exhibition that was local and sort of grew rhizomatically from that contact. And just quickly on background, I was a participant in an informal education artist project that was initiated by Jean Randolph and Cliff Eland, called Your Own Grad School, and it's always been a big inspiration for me in kind of creating collective forms with artists and others. And so I want to, before I talk about the main project, I want to speak briefly to this project called A Guest Plus a Host Equals a Ghost, and the second iteration of the playgroup called the Rehoming Playgroup. And it's really interesting to be following your beautiful and subtle work, Diyar, with a project this title and the content that you'll see. And so it was initiated as a collaboration with Dylan Robinson, who is a Stalo theorist and curator, now based again in British Columbia, and at the invitation of the Archive Counter Archive Research Network. And our intention really was to treat Etherington House as an archive, and you can see Etherington House there on the right side of this image. Whoops. Oh, that is. So our idea was to try to create new embodied experiences that joyfully reoccupy the spaces of the house, but also try to reckon with colonial legacies and colonial presence that are speaking through its architectures. And those two approaches, the kind of joyful reclamation and this more detailed reckoning, are in an interesting, I think, productive tension too, that maybe we can get into in the discussion period. And so I'm not going to say much more, except to say quickly that our intention as an institution, we have the privilege of getting a kind of rebuild of our galleries, and it's Etherington House that is going to stay. It was the beginning of Agnes Etherington Art Center, and it will continue to be the core of its practices. And our intention was for a very long time to turn it back into a home, and so to be a place for artists to live and to be in residence with us in the very center of our practices. And our director, Emily Changer, the powerhouse that she is, has worked with KNB, the architects, to make that a reality. And so I'm going to show you a bunch of images now without speaking about them. I just want to kind of give you a flavor of this project, and there's really not enough time. It was a complicated and detailed project. I'm going to flip through these. But you can see there on the left, a guest plus a host equals a ghost on this Marcel Duchamp multiple that's in our collection, haunting our collection. Columns in our basement, columns in the house. So this was a floor mat that took the archive of the furniture in Etherington House and created a sort of photocopied version that was kind of intercut with poetic responses. And the artists, Haema Armatrading and Hadley Howes, created a secondary binder with content like this that will now sit beside the original archival binder. And I included this image because this is where the floor mat is currently rolled up in the corner of my office. The artists left instructions with us, and in our continuing dialogue, are interested in it remaining a troubling object. And so it's not an artwork that goes in our collection. It's not furniture that we purchase because they explicitly state they don't want it to be insured. So the contract I'm developing with the artist now personally, is that I will be personally haunted by this floor mat until such time that an institution has a place for it. Okay, so the first playgroup had the promise of an exhibition that was a sort of relay on the original content. The second playgroup took place in a public space with a discrete period of time. It did have a curator's worst nightmare come true, which was opening a show with nothing at all. 2 minutes, okay, very quickly. But this last one really requires that it's interesting to echo what several of the panelists, Haema and others, have said about letting go of outcomes. And this is one in which we really need to trust collectivity and process. In fact, it feels strange to be here talking about it without what's really become a kind of circle of participants. JP Longboat and Cubes, Queen's University Biological Station, are kind of key partners and artists. And it's located in a sort of in-between space between Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territories. JP is a Mohawk storyteller, knowledge keeper, contemporary artist who's really personally motivated to rediscover the place, the homelands of his people on the north side of what's now called Lake Ontario. So this is a list of the artists. And we haven't, in this project, been directly collaborating with biologists at the station. It's much more intended to kind of create a sensory experience and really kind of emotional experience of the place. And that's, here's a few images from some of the process, underwater recordings, some drawing practice. We had one of the ceramicists in the group brought clay at some point that really was a revelation and a very difficult moment for me, because I had to let go and slow down and actually just be there and play with this clay. And clay became really a kind of core element of our collective conversation. And now clay is really important to our region, because our city, now known as Kingston, was once known in, we're not sure which language, indigenous language, as Cataraqui, which arguably means the city of limestone or the city of clay. And so now we're asking ourselves, and especially the poet Sadiqa Demayer, who's pictured here on the right, is asking, what would it mean for us to call ourselves the city of clay instead of the city of limestone, which represents the prisons, the forts. So I'm gonna flip through some of this list of things that we're up to here. Just a couple, because I'm running out of time, a couple images from one of the canoe trips that we took from Apinnaconn Lake and portaging into Heart Lake. Practicing seasonality, slowness, maps as Kerr. And, despite the effort it takes a curator and an institution to let go of outcomes, also need to be responsible stewards of public funding. So we have some outcomes. Things have been developing. One of those things is happening at another site that you can see on this map. This map we were given of the indigenous paddle routes. The little green circle on the right-hand side is this place called Number 9 Gardens, and they've invited Agnes to collaborate. I'm commissioning a number of land-based artistic projects for this site, including one by this group, the Along the Way Decolonial Ecologies play group. And they're interested in doing something with the shoreline of this creek that you can see kind of meandering through this image, which is very heavy in clay. And so what they're working on is traditional methods of firing clay, enacting a process of modeling, and then leaving objects to go back into the earth. The last thing I'll mention is this, the very last outcome, I think, of the project will be a performative circle that JP Longboat is working on at this place called Arbor Ridge in Kingston. And this came to light because another member of our group, Sebastian Delaine, was looking through some archaeological papers to look at indigenous presence in our area. And you can see in this image in the top right-hand corner of the illustration a kind of oval oblong shape. The traces of a apparently St. Lawrence Iroquois longhouse. And so JP Longboat is going to work with this play group to invite elders and participants to ceremony and to stand around on this site, which is now right in the middle of this suburban playground, essentially. So we're going to have in September, we'll be having an event that will relight the fires that would have been inside this longhouse. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So now we have Barbara Clausen. So take the mic.
works. Thank you for, hold on, just a second. No, you don't need to hold it. I wish it would have been mic'd up too. That would make it a bit easier, but that's okay. Diyar and I will keep it short. And voila, we'll do that. Well, I want to thank Leila. Thank you so much for inviting me, for me being part of this project. Thank you also for all your patience, for Leila Santiago for letting me be able to go through this talk. So I'm going to just try to be brief. I just want to say my research that I'm interested in the relationship between experience and knowledge as it unfolds at the intersection of the performative, the curatorial, and the archival. And I can really say that there's basically three questions as a curator and as a theoretician, as a professor, as a teacher, that guide my work. And those are really looking at performance-based practices as a form, fluid medium that oscillates between affect-based agency and conceptual site specificity. And I think we've seen that in several of the projects that were discussed today. So there's a few questions that guide me, and one is how do past and present performative practices find their various modes of existence within and beyond institutional frameworks? Secondly, how performance contributes as much as shapes concepts of authenticity and immediacy in the cultural sphere, specifically through the activation of the past through the presence and this creation of presentness within the framework of the exhibition or institutional spaces. And thirdly, how performance can be a generator, a filter, and a tool for critical interventions. In this case, I'm going to show you two case studies that have done this in museum politics at the intersection of the archive and the exhibition. I will speak about two critical practices of institutional interventions by the Guadeloupean-born, Berlin and Paris-based artist Jimmy Robert. Whoop, this is a little too fast, sorry. And the Northern Ontario-based Alutiiq artist, originally from Kodiak Island, Alaska, Tanya Luken-Linklater. Their work addresses through oration and embodied practices the institutional politics of inclusion and exclusion from a queer BIPOC perspective, challenging the legacies of ongoing colonialism. My objective is to look at how these two artists work across and between body, language, image, objects, and space, activating effective knowledge through new forms of archival memories and actions. So Robert, who has been working in the past with documentary practices from specific feminist positions, such as Yoko Ono or Yvonne Rainer, and I will go to a third example, Carolee Schneeman, for a project called Draw the Line, would activate the site of the staging of the works that he's showing. And so the photographs and manifestos and documentary footage Robert uses in his works are the basis for his own scripts and scores, which he then exposes and tests the limits of within the spaces that he performs and stages them. So I will show you the example Draw the Line from 2013. This could also be applicable for more recent projects such as Imitations of Lives from 2018, but in this case I'm choosing because of also the Canadian context. At the power plant, Draw the Line was based on Carolee Schneeman's seminal performance installation up to and including her limits from 73-76. And this consisted of a performance, the original of a performance, a text, an installation, as well as a series of documentary photographs, and specifically the manifesto. So for Robert, he wanted to use this work as a starting point to do something else. And that's maybe also the key to how he deconstructed the work. So on the first place, he used this photograph and this work in the manifesto to actually take on an architectural intervention. So I'm interested not necessarily in people reenacting or appropriate past performances, but actually using them as a kind of, as a starting point or as a script to then do something else with the institutional context or the power play or the power structure that they're invited to work in. So for Jimmy, Robert was important, together with Giulia Paoli, the curator, to open up that space, to open up these windows. So normally this is a totally dark boxed space, and he actually really obliged the museum to open all these walls so that light would come into the space, which was quite an endeavor for somebody doing a project in a museum, as anybody here could imagine, to actually make them architecturally change a space. So secondly, the other part of this project was based on the specific drawing and photograph, which he then worked on with Kate Davis, one of his collaborators, but also creating a script and creating a sound piece of him drawing on paper, which then echoed through the room on a smooth surface. That became also the part of his stage within the performance, and him acting out this manifesto by Schneemann, who was literally showing the viewers her physical limits of reaching out, being tied to a coil, moving, creating this painting. So he does this in a different way, moving through the body. So there was a set of posters that were free to take away. There was a set of photographic installations, and him taking this paper and actually moving with it in a different way, working through the exhibition space. And there was also a series of performances, which then he again cited the manifesto of Schneemann, but really changed it dramatically. So the curator, Giulia Poli, called this moving into the text and the image, using speech and movement as a tool. And as a tool, so to say, to then lift off Schneemann's feminist critique of painting history and to bring it to the surface and translate it into the present. So Robert, in this case, questions the complex relationship between the genealogies of feminist practices in art history. He frequently references from a queer BIPOC perspective through their site-specific inscription within the exhibition space and the architecture of the institution. One can see how the claim of authenticity that is linked to performative practices is affirmed through the engagement with another absent body in this case, and it also marks out the difference of struggles in relation to another. So we could say Robert asks, and I think others here have asked too, what kind of visibility counts? How can different levels of visibility be recognized and put to question? And what does witnessing and spectatorship mean as a mode of communication and a political form of participation and protestation? So the exhibition for Robert in this case is really a locus of time and space in which different memories, communities, individual lives and visions, as well as political forces can collide and manifest and kind of trigger, not in the sense of decolonializing the institution, but changing the process and the way we speak about them. And that also leads me to my second example. Oh, here's more images. I will quickly flip through. This also leads me to my second example, which is the work by Tanya Luken-Linklater, and that I will discuss. And this piece is called An Amplification Through Many Minds. This is a performance that was made for camera, and it was shown together as part of an installation called Flat Vessels, made by the hands of our grandmothers that we discern and decipher as potential messages of repair, both from 2019. And in her work, Luken-Linklater engages with the histories of Indigenous peoples' lives, lands, and structures of sustenance through performances, works for camera, installations, and writing. Her centering in and through embodied practices, again, is often in response to objects in museum collections, scores, architecture, site, ancestral belongings, generating ways of knowing and being what, in the words of Luken-Linklater, she's come to call as felt structures. So felt as in feeling, obviously, felt structures. Linklater describes these felt structures, and this is important because it's a way of working with the question of the colonializing force of the museum, even today ongoing. Luken-Linklater describes these felt structures as, I quote, as an organizing force that is unseen and that exists within and through the fabric of social life. According to the artist, they are generated, these felt structures, by surround or an ancient or contemporary short form that points to large forces, often banned and dismantled as a result of ongoing settler colonialism. In an interview with curator Candace Hopkins, Luken-Linklater speaks of repatriation as an embodied action, a protocol of visiting with the ancestral belongings in museum collections, an act of putting the pieces together again as a collective action and as a way of investing that knowledge in oneself. For the installation, An Amplification Through Many Minds, commissioned by the SFMO MoMA in 2019, Luken-Linklater researched and visited, and this is important, a Lutik and Unangan cultural belongings held in the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology in Berkeley, California. This institution is not interested in any form of repatriation. Yes, I'll finish as the others did. So she went into this deep storage and she worked on this project. And in the first segment, we see the artist work in the deep storage of the Alaska Commercial Collections on and off site at the Phoebe Hearst Museum in 2018 and 19. And while completely silent, we also see her gestures and read her words as subtitles as she encounters and carefully looks at the ancestral belongings of her community. The silence of this section is part of her methodology of opacity that is both circumstantial and deliberate, and a significant signifier for a silent body. So for her, this was a conscious decision of not one of lacking, but one of questioning the need for and lack of translation. By placing herself in the collection storage spaces and in relation to ancestral belongings, the artist points towards their ongoing life and former visits of Alutiiq Shukiak people visiting these ancestral remains in the collection. So this is the one thing that the Hearst Museum allows, that people can come back and visit these objects, which of course is, sad. Good that they can do this, but they should be repatriated. Encounters of nourishment and reciprocal exchange culminate in the staging of, in this case, Lucan Linklater's research. So I will now just very quickly go through these. Her work has three parts, and this is also in the video. There's the open rehearsals, which she developed with these choreographers and dancers, which was at the SFM MoMA. This was Ivani Oben-Malo, Sewin Gobert, and Dana Rosales. They're shown also in a video where they act out the difficulties through a choreography of what the artist had to encounter when she was working in the deep storages of these archives. So in this case, we see a working process that is translated back into a choreography that is presented as an open rehearsal. So there's no finishedness to this piece. The piece goes on. It's also very important for Lucan Linklater to say that she would have never had the power or agency to actually do this much work. She used the curators of the SFO MoMA to actually have that access in the Hearst Museum. So she really brings to light not only what happens or what is not accessible, but also what is needed for an artist of Indigenous heritage, in this case, to actually get access and to actually do this work. So this kind of whole setup of who do you need to work with becomes really, really important in these whole questions. And I think we've heard this also from the curatorial positions. I think the last thing that I'd like to show is that there was also a performance, a dance that was literally in the deep storage that was made for closed away objects. This happened during the wildfires in 2019. And it was kind of like a jump back into Kroeber Hall, into this deep storage facilities. And there were wildfires all around Berkeley. So they only had 15 minutes to actually film this footage inside. And Tanya says to this, "We're part of a climate grief. The wildfires responded to the work, and in this way, imperialism and colonialism continue in the present moment through the environmental disasters that affect us all." So as the objects are suffocating because of the way they are prepared to be kept forever, there was also all of the surrounding that was starting to suffocate because of the smokes. And I think obviously this is something that we can relate to right now. So there was also a last part, and I'm almost done, with an installation where this also shows this agency and power of the curators working with her, where she was actually able to take some of these little sewing bags and have them shown at the San Francisco MoMA in the end. So just to close off my discussion here, it's important to see that she really, according to Tanya Lukling, she made these objects made to exceed their own form, speaking to the viewer through the words and movements and silence around these objects. In this case, it's these sewing bags. The ritual of the exhibition and the proximity of the viewer simultaneously watching the video and sitting in front of an actual bags create a situation of contact and implication, ascribing new meaning to them. And it was ironically in this exhibition called Soft Power that they were even able to just get the status of being shown in this exhibition. Lucan Linklater explores the intersection of choreographic thinking and site-specific inherent to ecology of power, loss and being, the physicality responding. And she brings forth points of tension that challenge the system of the museum, creating another kind of archive. So my last sentence will be this: the methodologies and awareness of Robert and Lucan Linklater towards the past are rooted in a conscious compositional positioning of a practice of insistence, an insistence of presence, disrupting the institutional frameworks that continue to define the complexities of identity and belonging by opening a space of cross-temporality. Interventions that, as performance theorist Rebecca Schneider proposes, allow to live, and the no longer to live, to cohabitate and cross-interrogate and pose old questions anew or new questions of old again and again and again. Thank you.
Thank you. So we went a little bit over time, so we'll have half an hour of discussion with the audience, as well as our respondent Gary, who's connected online. I want to thank our presenters, also to rescue a bit of what I heard from everyone, the complexity of the concept of decolonization, and what Haema said, the sense of the concept being more of a process more than an ending point. So I think in a lot of these practices, we saw community-based approaches, collaboration, collective practice, as well as the concept of playground by Sunny, that Sunny introduced. Also, this inclusion of queer, BIPOC, feminist voices, perspectives, in order to, in a way, refuse resistance, disrupt, discomfort, rupture a bit of these institutions and the models, the frameworks of these established colonial structures. Also, concepts of storytelling, archival narratives, script, the sense of Charan's the use of language, right, before pre-English language, and also translation and transformation between worlds, objects, texts, the archive, identities, space, and the performance and the body, in a way, and how this leads to a bit of these sensory emotional experiences and practices to build new knowledge, create sustainable and decolonizing practices. So maybe we'll move to Gary if he has a question, maybe for all of us, a panelist, and then we can get a sense of if there are any questions in the audience here at ForSpace or online. So over to you, Gary. Thank you.
Thanks, Santiago. Can everyone hear me? Yep. Okay, that was fabulous and overwhelming. I'd have to say I'm extremely interested in a large number of the questions that have been raised, and can only really comment on a few things here. I guess one of the things that comes through is the tension between the nature of research and the, I think, specialist knowledge that the artists and the researchers bring to these forms that they've made, and the relationship to community and audience. For the communities that have been invited in and participate, let's say, in the production of the story, they have a specialist insight into it. And that relationship, I think, is very rich and very deep. But in terms of the colonized space of the museum, we're talking about general publics that don't have, A, the access that those specialized communities have, and B, they don't necessarily have the language or the expertise to invest in the kind of range and depth of the work that you're talking about. So my general question to everyone is really, how do you negotiate the power of the institution, whether it's institutions to do with the museum or publishing or academia? How do you negotiate constantly resisting that power with work that is in fact quite poetic and quite imaginative and quite visual? Because ultimately the question here, and a lot of narrativity is embedded in these works that have been shown, is how the stories are told and where the stories are told and whose stories are being told in any case. And then the question that I'm asking is, what is the effect of that story being told? How do you measure it? How do you see what impact there is?
Great.
So,
Maybe I'll let one of the curators maybe respond first, and then we can wonder, I don't know, Barbara, Haema, Sunny, Sunny.
I could try to respond. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, here it is. Okay. Great. Well, it's an excellent question and a difficult one to answer. I alluded to the Marcel Duchamp multiple that's in Agnes's collection, having been an inspiration for the title of that project that I mentioned, a guest plus a host equals a ghost. And we made the decision early on that we didn't really want to center that piece. So we didn't show that piece, it remained in our vault. We didn't speak to the influence of Duchamp's wordplay as the title of the work. Because I think from the very beginning, we were aware of the kind of pitfalls of institutional critique, like the way in which it inevitably ends up recentering the power of the museum and kind of creating a sort of two-way opposition. And so this is really what's behind the other tension that I mentioned in that project, which is about how, you can't just invite in excluded audiences without dealing with the ghosts first. I think the two sort of approaches that were in tension, I think, are both extremely important. But there was an interesting situation in which, as you saw in that project, the playgroup was trying to be a sort of support for communities who were coming in. Jatiwangi Art Factory, which was the Indonesian band that you saw playing there on the ceramic instruments. We created this kind of jam space for them. And also Hadley House was working on creating a sort of color picking swatch for the next exhibitors, which were Berlin Reed and who had curated this whole set of match pairings between chefs and artists, Black Canadian chefs and artists. And what the key moment that I think is really instructive is that, we made this effort to kind of eradicate the sort of colonial feel of this space that had a kind of exclusive and qualified kind of welcome to it. But without realizing it, potentially, we also sort of swept the rug out from some of the power of this, racialized artist project, because Berlin was expecting the house to be this kind of foil to respond to, and to bring this kind of liveliness into this other kind of space. So in a way, I think there's something to be learned there. I'm not sure I have a solution, but both of those approaches are important to accommodate.
Maybe I can jump in.
Sure, go ahead, Haema.
Just to say that from my perspective, at least, there is a kind of, I'm working from a curatorial point of view alongside other colleagues who are working in various aspects of learning and public programming and community engagement. So you're working almost within a cohort, within an institution. But what ended up happening for me, at least, was this sort of drawing in of aspects of this work of outreach and engagement as part of the curatorial research process. And there is this sort of sense of decentering your traditional audience, perhaps, that certainly in Victoria, we're working in a pretty small community. So there's not that sense of a general public as there might be in a big metropolis. And so what I was really trying to do was to find ways to bring another kind of audience is a complicated word, because often what would happen, especially dealing with Indigenous communities, is that people are coming in as extended family groups, and you're trying to find those key people, key artists who could help extend those invitations and bring them into your gallery space to expand this concept of audience. And inevitably what happens is that it becomes a different way of inhabiting the museum, let's say. So yeah, there are points of tension, but I think there's a lot of ways in which it becomes a very satisfying, potentially satisfying process of, you know, a number of people have used this idea of hospitality, but it does come back to that hospitality.
The museology and collecting are very much emerge out of a Western canon. Is it even possible to recuperate the museum space, or are we pushing against a dead brick?
Sort of such an interesting time when so many museums are repatriating their collections, right? And I think there's some very, very interesting conceptual potential there when you think about what happens when you empty out the museum, and if that's even possible or conceivable. It's only ever going to be partially realized, in my view, but it opens up space for so many other things and so many other ways of being a museum. People might
a lot of the decision making around museums is invisible, and it's not invisible in any conspiratorial sense. It's invisible because of technocratic and economic and sort of protocols of protection, but it also produces a kind of sense of authoritarianism through its corralling of expertise and tradition. Is there any way to, I guess, is there going to be a backlash from institutions in terms of making these transparent processes more visible, or attempting to break them down, or resisting them, or changing the nature of the interactions with audiences and communities that we have?
I think Barbara had some comments.
Yeah, I think from an art historical perspective, and kind of looking at what's happening in different institutions also in Europe, but also just looking at the work of somebody like Tanya Lucan-Linklater, who's been engaged, and many others who's been engaged in these practices for many years. I think there are some institutions that are trying to engage and to really, from an institutional perspective of power. I'm thinking of the Riedberg in Zurich, which Michelle Magema, who's going to be on one of the panels, I think this on the 16th, on Friday, she will speak about this. She's been implicated in a project in Zurich for long-term, for 4 to 5 years, to work with this very specific photographic collection, the Himmler collection, of a photographer who was in the framework, who was photographing in Congo, and this museum has this rich collection, and now they're inviting a whole group of Congolese artists to actually work with the museum on a really long-term project and really reconfiguring the collection. Major institutions have absolutely, you know, beginning, far from, and I think the idea of decentering that Haema, you've mentioned, is key to all this, and it's so way far not even beginning to make a difference, I think, in the big picture. But I think there are some curators and some museum boards that are actually invested, because I'm going now from top down, because it's not the curators who don't want to do it, but it's really the boards and the financing and all the political policies who are feeling the pressure that they have to, and that does come from the public, and that does come from communities. And I think the curatorial and the art historical and all that, we're just mediators. You know, we have long-term relationships with artists, hopefully, and not just parachuting people in. And we are working on that. But again, I think long work to be done. But there are cases, Gary, where if you look closely, there have been, you know, policies written on repatriation. There are first structural efforts, I do think, that have been made. And I think that does have to be said. But long way to go.
I also want to mention I recently heard a podcast of eFlux with Shimrid Lee on Decolonize the museum. And there was this interesting talk about how, or questioning if it was needed to burn down museums and start all over again, right? Which sounds as a very radical starting point, but she also mentioned this sense of perhaps you know, these other voices that were mentioning there should also be these other new institutions that have a kind of a new vision, right? As opposed to kind of starting to reshape the center point of not that it's not happening, but of previous museum or institutions. And within that, I think the already established museums or institutions, I think there was a bit of a talk on the Monday panel on the archival and what that is. And I think even with a little bit of what we do in our practice is this sense of activating spaces. We're not curators per se, but we think of this activation of a space. So it's not an archival that it's passive for, you know, just as you're watching and then you walk out and that's it. How to really activate the work and the spaces. So there is a conversation about what it's being presented. So there is a conscious awareness of your presence in this, either museums, institutions, in academia, or even in an installation work, right? Like how to engage people to think critically about the space where they're at as well and what they're witnessing. I think Charan wanted to.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things is that we as an artist and researcher, we tend to think that the art museums and archives are this place where we can find everything. But there's so many communities because of the colonial power, because of many other kind of things that the system that were in place, a lot of people couldn't make it to the museum. So there is no corpus to research. There is nothing to research about those communities. Like for instance, like if I find anything about in the archives or queer archives or whatever archive that they are around, you know, since the HIV began, you know, for last 30 years, there's no single sentence has been written about Kothis, which is not connected them with HIV and poverty. So where's the archives of joy, where's the archive of pleasure, and is this community only exist in those kind of archives, or can we have other kind of archives, or can we recreate archives, or can we actually forge the archives to create? So that's why a lot of the work that I try to do is to kind of create these glossaries, trying to make them people to think in different kind of ways, what are the kind of you know, terminologies, for instance. And so yeah, so I think fiction is one of the things that one could think about, that the archives that were not existed, and how do we create those archives? And yeah, so that's what I.
Yeah, I think the sense of the script, the storytelling. I think I'm connected to Barbara as well.
I think you two should talk about this. Santiago and Laura, because I think you're telling with your project. I'd love to hear. I don't know. I hope that's okay, but I'd love to hear more, because I think that's exactly this kind of creating these new counter narratives and not just leaning back but moving forward. Would you mind saying a bit more?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because when we talk about the effects of colonialism and without obviously taking lightly any of the violent history that comes along with that, we think that is just the problem of the other. So when we talk about decolonizing spaces, a lot of times it's like bringing up, and rightfully so, you know, the perspectives of narratives of people who have not been included. So it also then becomes like another process of othering. So the institution steps in again in othering again the other. So like the art's work as well, and same thing as Charan, like showing the limits of language is not just the other's problem, it's everybody's problem. Climate crises are everybody's problem. So in a way, through uncanniness, through surrealism, through fictional storytelling, that's how we tap into everybody's, or sort of like a broader sense of displacement and the really harmful effects of a categorized, heteronormative, extractivist society that we live in, which is not just the problem of, I mean, certain communities feel it a lot more harshly, and there's no denying of that, but allowing fiction and storytelling to be the entryway where everybody can sort of be part of the conversation, and seeing how being under a colonialist structure is demoralizing and harmful for all of us. So yeah, definitely fiction and storytelling is how it plays into that.
Well, playing with this sense of creating discomfort, I think that was something mentioned a lot, this sense of disrupting and creating ambiguous spaces as well to reflect, to engage in critical thinking. And I think even your pieces, your sculptures had this sense of discovery too, so the emotion around it, but there's also an ambiguity that, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that as well.
Well, I will not talk about the sculptures more, but let's talk about what you're exactly proposing here. I think when there is a guest, there's a host. Okay, like you said, there is a narrative of the excluded, but then if there's an excluded, there is an there's an excluder. Like I think going with the dualities allows that room, like to reflect. Okay, if there is a guest in this room and you are not the guest, then who are you and how are you being in that role? If that's your role to be a host, are you a good host? Who is the host? Who's your guest? And how, like, I'm of course using this both metaphorically and also in its real first meaning. I think that is why I'm interested in dualities, that allows that room, instead of turning this work about, like I said, of course, we are artists. There's really deeply personal reasons why we get out of our bed and get into trouble of making all these works, right? But it is not made with the drive or the passion of ourselves. It's like to create this room where we can have a mutual contemplation. So this is why I am more interested in words and objects and senses and materials that can leave that in between space.
How do we tap into shared experiences, which is, I think, a counter narrative to colonialist ways of perceiving, right? Like actually, like as you said, community building, having shared experiences of a site, re-signifying sites together, allowing our subjective knowledge to become part of the larger narrative. That's, I think, how we enter into these paths towards decolonizing, which is super challenging.
That's great. I think maybe given the time, we'll open up a bit of, I don't know if there's any questions from the audience as well. Oh, Haema, sorry.
If you'd like to open up, that's really fine as well. But just very quickly, I really like this idea of ambiguous spaces, and I was kind of thinking, can museums be ambiguous spaces, which is kind of what we're pointing to, I think, in the curatorial kind of work that some of us are doing. But I had an experience not so long ago with an Indigenous knowledge keeper who said to me that he thought of museum spaces as safekeeping spaces for Indigenous objects. And it led me to think about museum processes and how a museum actually is a set of processes as well. Curatorial, conservation, education, all these different departments that get siloed and perhaps hidden behind the scenes. But when you think of it that way, it is also about radicalizing our internal processes of the museum's functions, to then be able to think about, how can a museum be a safekeeping space for cultural objects, cultural belongings that can be taken out, used in ceremony, brought back, this kind of thing. So it's a completely radical rethinking of how a museum might function, both as in this context of repatriation, but also as a place of restitution. So.
Yeah, and I think in these ambiguous spaces and the sense of the host or the audience that we might not want to call audience, we often think of them as performers as well, that we're inviting into spaces where they might activate something else. They might find themselves on a screen. So also blurring and turning this sense of the audience or the person that's visiting the spaces as an active participant. I think that's an important thing for us in the practice. I don't know if there are any questions in the audience or on Zoom. Feel free to turn your camera on or write them in the chat. Otherwise, we can continue maybe mentioning some of.
I'll jump in, and I would like to ask the panel to reflect on this moment of arts activism. It seems that there's a lot of conservative pressure on universities and other institutions, even political institutions and governments, whereas there's a tremendous amount of arts activism going on across the globe. And I'm wondering if you think this is a blip or if you think it's actually a paradigm shift, that arts activism will become the predominant mode of artistic expression or cultural expression.
Who wants to maybe take this one?
I do think we are at a time of shift, and I think it reflects on the art we make, but I have to say, I believe all artists activists, because we leave book changed, we leave a conversation changed. And I do believe in the strength of these slow and small persistent changes are stronger than anything else. So in that sense, I always believe all art is activist. It creates change. And but it is true that I understand what you mean by the activism, what you meant by activism. If I'm not getting it wrong, there is a big shift in our lives. There's a huge change with all sorts of crises. There has never been a crisis of displacement. It's in the record highs, not just because of the population being high, in the ratio of like displacement and economical, war, ecological, and they are all connected. And of course, this is going to reflect on art. We are passionate and sensitive to life as artists. But other than that, I do believe art inherently is an activist thing. And I actually try to position myself more into that because I have seen and grew up in an environment where we demanded fast change because there was always crisis. Like, we can't wait one more day, but I do believe that the smaller changes stayed and that nothing happens fast. I don't know how we are going to move forward from this. Are we going to continue? There will always be a group who will be doing a slower work and faster work, and we need both, I think. But it does come from a place of need. We need change, and there is a big shift in our society in many different aspects, not just about the museums that we're talking about. There are even things that are more immediate in different people's lives. So that's how I feel about it.
Thank you. I think, I was thinking how we've had conversations on how us as queer BIPOC individuals, our whole being and our essence, I would say it's political. Every project that we do, in a way, there is a political aspect to it, and it is to raise and engage in this type of conversations. So in a sense, there's definitely an activist approach to raise this awareness, to talk about equitable, sustainable, and diverse practices. So I don't know if we have, maybe we have time for one last comment. Okay, so, well, thank you for space. Thank you everyone that attended online and here at For Space, and to our presenters. I also wanted to remind you that today at 3 p.m. we're going to be doing a film screening here at For Space, as well as at cfmdc.tv website. It's the Michelle Mohabir's Queer Coolitudes, and we'll have a Q&A discussion with the filmmaker as well as Roshini Kempadu at 4:30 on Zoom, the same Zoom link that you're connected. We'll continue these conversations also in 2 panels, one tomorrow at 12 and one on Friday at 10 in the morning, again with the same Zoom link. So thank you, everyone.